Hello and welcome to my new episode of my podcast, One Opinion from Europe. Today, I would like to take a look at the European perspective on the US-Israeli military campaign in Iran, actually known as Trump's War of Choice. Now, I will be giving you a brief history of war on the European continent, and then we will be taking a look at a few of the views of the European leaders, namely Keir Starmer, who is the Prime Minister of the UK, Friedrich Merz, who is the Chancellor here in Germany. I live here in Germany. Also Emmanuel Macron, who is the Prime Minister in France, and also Giogia Meloni, who is the Prime Minister in Italy, and rounding up the selection with Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain. Finally, I will be giving you my one opinion, which I believe is actually a mainstream European opinion. So let's get started. Now, in the US, the last time a war raged on complete American soil was the Civil War, which finished in 1865. It was fought against the Union and the Confederacy, and of course it was a brutal war. Everybody was involved, and ultimately led up to, it is estimated, 750,000 casualties. Now, here in Europe, our history of war raging on our soil is much younger. Most famously, World War II, which started here in Germany, where I am today, but it then spread on to France, the Netherlands, Poland, Italy, and ultimately Russia. So we have within our families, for example, my mother, she grew up in Nazi Germany. She was always very wary when I would ask her, why didn't they just speak up and say something? And she said by the time they realized it was going on, it was too late. They did not have the advantage of internet or telephones. So she became a nurse. And in 1945, there was one of the coldest winters. She actually managed to flee from East Prussia, where she was working in a hospital, and the Russians were advancing. And originally, the last train out of Eastern Prussia, it was not allowed that young people were to be on that train. She had, with 3 other colleague nurses, they had hidden a bottle of wine in the grand piano, and they had loaded up their sled to go through the snow and try to escape that way. And they thought, well, they will just drink this last bottle of wine before they start on their way. A young doctor came in and said to them, well, what are you doing here? Why aren't you on the train? So they said, well, we weren't allowed to get on the train. He said, forget that. You just get on that train. So ultimately, they left and squeezed their way onto the train. The train took 10 days to reach Hamburg, and it was one of the coldest winters in history. People died on that train. It must have been horrific. My mother didn't really like to talk about it, but she did once say that she remembers them throwing dead babies out into the snow just so that they would have a little bit more space within the wagons. They were cattle wagons, basically. My father was an RAF pilot in Great Britain. He was very young. He got his pilot's license before he even got a car driving license. And he was one of the lucky ones who survived the war. He also had various stories of how the planes behind him all got shot down and he was the only one who managed to land unharmed. So I was very lucky he survived. Now, all of our families here in Europe, we have stories like that. My partner is Italian, and his mother, who is now 91, she was a young child during the war. She still recoils when she hears thunder or some loud noise. And my partner said that is still just as a reflection of her childhood growing up in World War II in Italy. So more recently, we had the Bosnian War. That was a brutal ethnic cleansing war. It raged between 1992 to 1995. Bosnia is only 1,000 kilometers away from where I live today. Our nanny, she had fled from Bosnia. She came from Bosnia, Oliveira, and she grew into the hearts of our family and my children. She was the best nanny we had. Her husband was still fighting in the Bosnian War, and ultimately he fled as well. Now, what happened to him? Because he had fled the fighting, they set alight his family's house in Bosnia, so they had nothing to return to, but they worked very hard here in Germany to earn some money. And when they returned, they ultimately built a wonderful Bavarian house on the street in Bosnia. And we went to visit them various times, and my children grew up having seen and heard the tales and the horrors of this Bosnian war. When we went down there the first time, the fields were still fenced off because of the mines, so the children could actually visualize this. There were the blue helmet, NATO soldiers still patrolling, and Olivera took us into one of her local churches, and you could see the bullet holes. There was a row of bullet holes where people had been lined up and shot. So war is something which people here in Europe actually know, not just from a military perspective. We've seen it in our families. And finally, we have a war raging on our doorsteps, the Ukraine-Russia war, where we know that millions of people have been killed. And of course, the big worry here in Europe is that one day Russia will actually manage to come into Europe, namely Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. And so we are very critical of war. Everywhere we have the refugees from Ukraine, they become our colleagues, our friends. So we are very conscious of what a war does, not just the risk to our military, but also to our families, our friends, our businesses. And this is why we are very critical of wars. When the Iraq war started off, Germany decided not to take part. We provided logistical training support, but we had no boots on the ground. So this is just a little bit of our history and what our feelings towards war is contrasted with the US. It was a long time ago you had war raging on your soil. So now let's take a look at the reactions of some of our European leaders to Donald Trump's war of choice. Starting off with Keir Starmer, who is the Prime Minister of the UK, he has a carefully balanced but somewhat controversial defence-only stance. He rejects explicitly participating in regime change from the skies, saying that we should have learned our lessons from the Iraqi war. Also, he has concluded that under international law, this military campaign is illegal. Now, this is why he is allowing only the use of military bases with a specific and limited defense purpose. Now, of course, Donald Trump was not very happy with all of this, and he made his disappointment very vocal. But Donald, that is what you get when you start a war on your own accord and without consulting any of your allies. You will get a very defensive posture. Also, not to be underestimated, the Greenland crusade that he started on in January, where he said he would be prepared to take Greenland by force. Ultimately, the Europeans took a tough stance. They said, okay, right, we will go on for a very hard trade war, and if necessary, we will send our military out to Greenland. And of course, in good old Donald Trump fashion, he backed down. So now in France, we have Emmanuel Macron, who is the French premier. He has positioned France to be a mediator in this conflict. So hopefully Donald Trump may take him up on that, as I think there are still ties to Iran, which Donald Trump could have used in his negotiations initially. Macron has also been most vocal in questioning the legality of these military strikes, but he has also strongly condemned the Iran retaliatory strikes and is working towards securing maritime routes, which of course would be very important for our European energy supplies. French forces are participating in legitimate self-defense actions to protect Allied airspace, but also there will be no boots on the ground or military support from France. Now, how did Friedrich Merz, our German Chancellor, react? Well, he has had a more supportive, but also a non-combative approach to this issue. His words are more aligned with Washington. He shares the relief that the brutal Mueller regime has been dealt severe blows, and I think that is the feeling here throughout Europe. However, he has clearly ruled out any German military participation, and that is, of course, a big relief to us here in Germany. Interestingly, he has dismissed claims of international illegality by arguing that decades of diplomacy and sanctions had failed. So nothing else was left but to try this approach. That, of course, went down very well with Donald Trump. When he was in Washington, his main focus, however, was on economic issues like securing energy supplies, and also discussing how will the funding work to rebuild Iraq. Now, of course, that is Germany is the purse of Europe, so we will probably be called in at that stage. We basically buy our way out of military conflicts. Now, Friedrich Merz was in fact rewarded by praise from Donald Trump, so that visit went quite well. And then in Italy, we have Giogia Meloni, who is the Prime Minister. She has a unique geopolitical argument. She claims that the Middle East chaos is a direct result from the erosion of the international law during Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And I don't think she may be very wrong there. Now, she also voices clear condemnation of Tehran's retaliatory strikes. However, she is critical of the fact that Europe was not part of the decision-making process. Her primary goal is not to widen the conflict. Italy will fulfill its role as a NATO logistical hub, but it will not be dragged into any form of combat. Now, last but not least, in our parade of European leaders, we have Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez of Spain, who has been the most vocal critic of the US-Israeli military campaign and has called it illegal and unilateral. He has refused to allow US use of jointly operated military bases, and famously he has made the one statement to Donald Trump, no to the war. Now, of course, this did not go down very well with Donald Trump, and he has threatened, in good Donald Trump style, trade embargoes. So let's see where that goes. Now, to finally wrap up this episode, I would like to give you my one opinion from Europe. This time, my opinion, I do not believe is a very extreme one here in Europe and is, in fact, very mainstream. The feeling here is that Donald Trump and the United States of America basically went out on their own, obviously together with Bibi Netanyahu. Whether Donald Trump is his lapdog or not, that is being discussed. But our feeling here in Europe is you did it on your own, so you cannot expect any support from us here in Europe. Now, we will obviously be giving logistical support as with our military bases, but I think that will be the maximum that the US can expect from us. Donald Trump did a lot of damage in January with his crusade on Greenland. And it's not that long ago, so Europeans have not forgotten how he threatened to invade Greenland and basically take part of one of our sovereign countries. So to sum it up, I agree with Pedro. I agree with Pedro Sanchez, no to the war. And I think that is something which you will hear from many people here in Europe. So I do hope that this has been interesting for you. So please join me on other episodes and feel free to click and subscribe. Also, if you would like to leave any comments on what your views are, you may be in Asia or the US and you may have different views to our European view. Please feel free to leave comments or any suggestions you might have for other topics you would like to hear from me. Thank you and take care. Bye.